Mr. Stein, good to see you.
Great, it's great to see you again. Thank you for having me on your show.
Now, what do you see is the most important issues the American business communities in China are looking at?
Well, there's two kinds of issues. The most important issue, if you ask our members for the last 4 years, is the state of the U.S.-China relationship. And our members are happy that over the last year, the two countries have taken steps to stabilize the relationship. So that's very good. So that's one part. But the other part is the regulatory environment that's increasingly complex that affects everybody. So those are the two most important issues, regulation and the state of the bilateral relationship.
When they see the relationship as stabilizing, what are they referring to?
So what they're referring to is that we saw starting a little over a year ago, we saw the relationship between the U.S. and China was becoming more and more tense. So we were very happy to see that the two countries sort of agreed that that kind of relationship, I mean, the two largest economies in the world, you cannot have a situation where the relationship continues to deteriorate and each one has to act and react. So we were very pleased that the two governments took steps to stabilize it. And I think both countries get a lot of credit. I mean, we saw on the U.S. side, we saw a year ago, we saw Tony Blinken came, the Secretary of State, followed immediately by Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, followed by Gina Raimondo. And then we saw a similar commitment from the Chinese side last November when President Xi Jinping went to San Francisco, met with Biden at Woodside. Important decisions came out of that, and then met with the business community. So the two countries took steps to stabilize it. And so I think that's created a little more optimism on the part of the business community. So those are the things that I think really helped drive it forward.
The meeting between the two presidents during the on the sidelines of the APEC economic leaders meeting is extremely important, but many also wonder not only the significance of that meeting, but the implementation of the principles agreed by the two heads of state during the meeting. How do you see the implementation so far? Especially this is an election year in the U.S.
So I think that what we see is a couple of things that are important. The first is they did succeed in stabilizing the relationship. But what they didn't succeed in doing is there's some really deep divisions between the U.S. and China on a lot of things, on export controls, on geopolitics. There's a lot of things that divide the two countries. And agreeing to create dialogues and have new channels to communicate is good, and it helps bring stability. But that in and of itself doesn't solve the underlying problems. And so I think that what we're hopeful is that over time, some of those problems can be resolved. But places where I think it's been somewhat positive, I think the U.S. government has definitely given more information to the Chinese government about issues of concern that lead them to do export controls and sanctions. So I think there's been good implementation, at least on information sharing on the U.S. side. And the sense I get is the U.S. has been very pleased with implementation on the agreement on fentanyl. So I think both sides have given a bit, but really the underlying issues are there. And that's why I say they brought stability to the relationship. And the hope would be that over the next year or longer, they could find ways to build on that stability and move things to a better place. But I don't think they're there yet.
The interests of the business communities from both sides are very intertwined. However, as Mr. Stein, you pointed out earlier, this process of settling down on both the nature and the details of the bilateral relations will likely to last for quite some time. So from your perspective as the chairman of AmCham in China, what would be the best strategies for business communities on both sides to go through this tunnel before seeing the eventual light at the end of it?
Well, I think that where we are now, I think that what I'm telling businesses and what we're seeing from our members is our members feel like things are better than they were and things are more stable, but there's not this expectation that it's going to get dramatically better soon. It's going to be a very incremental process for the relationship to improve. And so what we're telling our members and what we're seeing is effective is both governments have got concerns. And increasingly what companies have to do is they have to look at the areas where the U.S. government will allow them to operate and see where that overlaps where the Chinese government will allow them to operate, and then walk on this narrow path that allows them to take into account issues of concern on the American side and on the Chinese side. And for many companies, that's very challenging to do. Imagine if you're in semiconductors or if you're in biotech or aviation or areas where both countries feel like they have an interest that may even be a national security interest. That's really hard, and it takes some really deft work by the companies to navigate that.
How do you work with your members in order to solicit opinions and ways of communications with the political leaders and relevant organizations to narrow down and to make it specific?
Yeah, so I think most of our discussion, I wouldn't say is with political leaders. Our discussion is really with the technocratic regulators. And because the technocratic regulators, whether they're in the United States or in China, recognize the value of having U.S. business here. And so what we try and do is we try and look at each industry and have those industries identify what are the real impediments and what would need to change if there was going to be more investment or a more fair business climate. And they do that on the US side and on the Chinese side. So in our white paper, we've got recommendations for both governments. It's not just for the American government, not just for the Chinese government. So that's the first part. But the second is, we bring together many, many members. We had over 100 member companies involved in this process to identify what are the key issues that would make sense for the two governments. And then the members themselves work to build consensus and then to draft recommendations and to issue a scorecard. So when we say we're the voice of American business, really, this white paper is truly the voice of American business. And between us, I'll tell you, I hear from European companies and Japanese companies, and they say, you're our voice as well.
We see the U.S. companies are doing not only their businesses here in the Chinese market, but also using China as manufacturing base, research base, and several other functions to provide products to their home market in the U.S. and also to markets elsewhere. So we see a combination of these. So how do you see the U.S. businesses, with a combination of all of these functions, think about the best way to communicate with Washington?
Yeah, so I think one of the really important lessons that our companies learned and that Chinese companies learned is, during COVID, everybody realized just how vulnerable supply chains can be, and everybody suffered, and everybody realized supply chains needed to be more resilient. And so one of the messages that we have for Washington is rightly concerned about supply chains. Well, guess what? So are we. So is the business community. We're the ones who felt it long before the U.S. consumer did, long before it was even recognized by the U.S. government. And so one of the important messages is to say we share the concerns of the U.S. government, and we have ways to get there. And so I think that's one important tool. The second, though, is that one of the really important ways that U.S. business is involved in China is in R&D. There are companies that don't even do business in China, but that have R&D here because there are many highly qualified Chinese workers, STEM trained, engineers, etc. And that if American companies are going to be competitive globally, they need to be able to take advantage of the best research available anywhere on the planet and the best workers anywhere on the planet. In some cases, to be globally competitive, it means they need to be in China. And so in an era of strategic competition, as the U.S. government says, and maybe it is an era of strategic competition, that part of the U.S. strategy for that needs to be to have American companies competing in China. And in many cases, that's going to include doing research and development and other things here, because we need to be able to compete with peers all over the planet, not just at home, not just in China.
So how would you raise the awareness of the politicians, when you are doing the door knock, especially when the geopolitics and the so-called political correctness is blowing the wind to a very different direction?
Yeah. So when we go to Washington, it's obviously not every member that wants to meet with us. But the members who do want to meet with us and who do agree to meet with us do because they genuinely want to better understand what's happening on the ground. People who've already made up their mind have got no reason to see us. People who have fixed views don't actually want to hear different opinions. So the people who meet with us, even though at the end of the day, even if they don't agree with us, they want to hear what we have to say because they value having voices who've been on the ground, who've been working in China and doing business in China because they think that helps them do their job better. So it doesn't mean we persuade everybody, but we do have a respectful dialogue, and I think it's helpful even to those who don't agree at the end of the day with our message. It does help them have at least a broader understanding of what it's really like in China, what's really happening on the ground.
On the other hand, this is an election year, as we said, in the United States. So how do you prepare for the worst scenario? We remember years ago there was a dramatic change of the trade policies toward China, for example, and then business communities from both sides got hurt. Now we see the unpredictability is once again very high, not just for this year, but also for the years to follow. Yeah. So how do you and your other colleagues from the American business community here in China look at those possibilities and plan?
So I think what we're seeing that a number of companies are looking at where we are now in the relationship. And they recognize that the Biden administration wants to keep this stability, just like the Chinese government wants to keep this stability. And so I think they're trying to move ahead with projects and other things right now while the situation is stable and predictable. Because at the end of the day, none of us know what's going to happen after the third Tuesday of 2025 in January. And so people are trying to get done what they can do now. But irrespective of the outcome of the election, the American Chamber's position isn't going to change. And the position is that investment by Chinese companies in the United States is good. And investment by US companies in China is good and helps both countries. And that more trade, as long as it doesn't affect anybody's national security, is also good. And that for the governments, that having equal application of the law to all, American and Chinese, or in China, Chinese and American, and transparency is good for everyone. And finally, there should be dialogue. And the two governments, no matter what the disagreements are, need to be able to talk. And so that's what we tell the Biden administration. And if there's a Trump administration, that's what we will tell them as well. Our position isn't going to change just because there's a change in the U.S. government or U.S. administration.
There are concerns about fewer and fewer Americans in China.
Yes.
And now we see some students, American students, even though very slowly, are coming back to study here in China in some of the most prestigious universities in China, for example. But the people-to-people exchanges still need a better momentum. Yeah. You've been living here on and off in China for 25 years. Mm-hmm. So, Sean, you know what it was like when people-to-people relations was at its highest days. Yeah. So how does business community in China from the U.S. try to cultivate this atmosphere and bring more practical support to this movement? Yeah,
well, I got to tell you something that I think will surprise you, or at least it'll surprise a lot of people. And that is, despite the tension between the two countries, we've been working, for example, with a foundation called the Helen Foster Snow Foundation. I only mention that because they were invited by President Xi to attend the event in San Francisco. And they've set up a program which is going to bring American middle school students to China over the summer. And they thought they should start modestly with maybe 100 or 150 American students to come over. And what they found is they've talked to parents and talked to students and to schools saying, you know, will you pay to bring your child and let us do a summer camp with them in China? What they found is that the demand has been overwhelming. Wow. So what hasn't changed is Americans are fascinated with China. And Americans feel a real affinity for China. And the proof is, despite the level of tension and difficulty between the two governments, we have the small foundation in the United States creating a program where for American students to come, and they have more American students wanting to sign up than they can possibly accommodate in the first year. So that's what gives me hope that at the end of the day, there will be political differences and geopolitics will divide the countries. Differences over trade policy will strain the relationship. But at the end of the day, Americans like China and they like the Chinese people and they want their children to understand China. So I think the people-to-people initiatives are really important. And even though we'll never get to maybe, you know, where I think we've got 300,000 Chinese students in the United States, we're never going to get that close on the U.S. side coming to China. But everything we can do to have more Americans come to China and see for themselves, I think the better it is for the world and better it is for the relationship.
What would be the advice you would give to them if you're meeting them in China, you know, when they just arrive in China?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you the biggest frustration. So in my role in my day job and in my role at AmCham, a week does not go by when I don't have an American company calling and saying, we want to send our CEO, we want to send our senior leadership. Is it safe? And of course, they don't want a yes or a no. They want an analysis, they want a discussion. And so we talk through them about what are the risks and where would the risks be. And in 99.99% of the time, we're like, of course it's safe, and come. And then I tell them that even my own daughter is coming to study in China. And if it wasn't safe, I wouldn't have my daughter here. So that's the advice.
That's the most persuasive advice, I guess.
Right. But the most important then is that I think, in both countries, it's very easy to get a distorted view of the other country if all you're doing is reading social media or even traditional media, and that there is no substitute for coming and seeing for yourself. So that's my advice, is come yourself, send your children, send your CEO, send your board members, but they need to come and see for themselves. Otherwise, they will not understand the opportunities and they won't understand the challenges.
Sean, what a pleasure. Thank you so much.
I've enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you very much.